In Parashat Shofetim we read about the commandment to appoint a king, mitzvat HaMelech. And the Torah Torah commands us, Ki tavo el haaretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha v'yirishta v'yashavta ba v'amarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. When you come into the land that God has given you and you've inherited it and settled it, and you say, I want to place upon myself a king, like all the other nations around me. The Torah says, Som tasim alecha melech asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo mikerav achecha tasim alecha melech lo tuchal latet alecha ish nochri shelo achicha hu. You need to place upon yourself a king. He needs to be one of your brothers. You can't have a stranger be the king. And then there's this list of qualifications the Torah commands us on what the king can do. Lo yarbel o susim, he's not allowed to have too many horses. Velo yashiv et ha'am Mitzrayim leman harbot sus. You can't return apparently Egypt was a source of horses. They can't go back to Egypt to get too many horses. Because God said you're not allowed to return to Egypt for political reasons. This theme is going to be developed much later in Sefer Yirmiyahu, and the whole connection between Egypt and Israel becomes very problematic. Further, the Torah says, Lo yarbel nashim, v'lo yasru levavo v'chesed v'zahav lo b'olamot. He's not allowed to have too many wives, he's not allowed to have too much money. And then following that, V'yach yishivto akiseh mamlachto, when he sits on his throne, he needs to write a Sefer Torah and read from it all the time. There's all of this is in order to serve the purpose of levilti rum levavo me'echav ulevilti sur min hamitzvah yamin usmol leman yarich yamim al mamlachto hu vana b'kerev Yisrael, so that his heart should not be raised up from his brethren, and that he shouldn't digress or diverge from the commandments right or left, in order that his kingship will be perpetuated by himself and by his descendants amongst Israel. The Torah offers up a vision of kingship which is radically qualified, and this vision is sort of striking. The king is appointed. He must be a member of the Jewish people, but beyond that, he's not allowed to have too much military power, not too many horses, not too many wives and money. The wives are a symbol of diplomatic power, right? A king in the ancient world would marry princesses and important women in order to create diplomatic alliances. And he's not allowed to have too much kesef v'zahav, not too much money. The king is radically qualified in his kingship. I mean, who wants to be a king when you can't have any of the things that give you power? The constraints on power here are very, very severe. Furthermore, the king's sort of main focus, he has to write a Sefer Torah and read from it all of his whole life. His focus is about keeping the Torah and not about doing the things that we generally expect kings to do. The fear that the king will abuse his power is explicit, levilti rum levavo, but it has two aspects. It's that he shouldn't raise his heart above his brethren. In other words, there's an interpersonal relationship here that needs to be maintained. The king should not become arrogant and think that he has special rights because he's the king, or that he's better than any other Jew. And furthermore, that he shouldn't lo yasur min hamitzvah. He shouldn't go off the path of keeping the mitzvah, but his relationship with God should also not be corrupted by the power that's been given to him. When we look at the Jewish kings throughout Tanakh, and then later on in Jewish history, these mitzvot were not actually successfully practiced. Most famously, Shlomo had 1,000 wives and was a rich and powerful king who had many horses and a great amount of gold and silver. The image of Shlomo is of this king who essentially breaks all of these rules. He marries the daughter of Pharaoh. And it leads one to wonder, what exactly is the point of this mitzvah, which seemed to have been unsuccessfully kept throughout all the generations. The institution of monarchy, I think, needs to be understood not merely in the context of particularly monarchy, but it's an essential question in political thought. Do we seek centralization of power, or do we seek diffusion of power? And each side of that question has different advantages and disadvantages. Diffusion of power, the advantage, of course, is that whatever corruption there might be, its ability to do harm is significantly limited. Centralization of power has the potential for great evil, but also the potential for great good. Particularly in the context of the Jewish king, the notion of uniting Am Yisrael and a common goal of worshiping God, of building the Beit HaMikdash, all of those things require a centralization of power and a king to lead the people towards those goals. We see this dynamic played out once again in Sefer Shmuel. When the people come to Shmuel at the end of his life and ask for a king, Shmuel is very reluctant and very antagonistic to the idea, because Shmuel is essentially the image of the success of a diffused power system. Shmuel is the leader of a very diffuse country, but he's the leader who's successful, and the people serve God. The succeeding king, Shaul, is a failure. It causes a disaster, and the Plishtim, though Shaul initially succeeds against the Plishtim, he essentially becomes conquered by the Plishtim, and it's a situation of tremendous travail. The initial attempted kingship is not successful, and this is something that Shmuel, I'm not going to read through the whole thing, it'll take too long, but warns us of very extensively. So we remain with the question, does the Torah conceive of the monarchy as an ideal, as something that we want to achieve, or is it something which is a concession, right? When the people come and ask for a king, the Torah allows the possibility of monarchy, but only under very, very severe constraints. This idea plays itself out in Sefer Shmuel, but it's further addressed in Chazal, in Torah Shebaal Peh. In Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Chaf Amud Bet, we have a machloket between the Tanaim. Chen haya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'knisatan la'aretz. Rabbi Yehuda says there were 3 mitzvot which the people were commanded upon entering the land. La'amid lehem melech, la'achrit zaro shel Amalek, u'livnot lehem bet habechira. Rabbi Yehuda sees centralization of power as an ideal. There's 3 commandments that are commanded. They need to have a king, and once they have a king, they can destroy Amalek, they can destroy evil, and they can build the Beit HaMikdash. They can realize the ideal of God living amongst the people in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Nehorai Omer, on the other hand, Rabbi Nehorai says, Lo ne'emara parasha zo ela keneged tav o matav. This whole idea of allowing for a king is only against the complaint of the people, only in response. It's only permitted. It's not an ideal, it's a concession. Shene'emar ve'amarta asima alai melech. I will place upon me a king. Whereas the desire for a king comes from the people, it's not something that God desires essentially. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, Zikenim shebador kahogen shalu, shene'emar צנע לנו מלך לשבטנו, אבל עמי הארץ שבהם קלקלו, שנאמר, והיינו גם אנחנו ככל הגויים בשבטנו, מלכנו מייצא לפנינו. The initial request for the king under Shmuel, where they asked for a king and eventually Shaul was appointed, the initial request was a legitimate one. We want a king to judge us. The notion of the king is in order to create justice and to improve the situation of Am Yisrael and to create a more peaceful and just society. That is an ideal for which centralization of power is of value. The people, though, they corrupted it. They said, we want to be just like the other goyim, we want to be just like the other nations, and we want the king to go in front of us, to fight our battles. It's an entirely different vision of the point of centralization of power. This fundamental political question isn't going to be resolved not now or not in the future. But the way that the Torah deals with it is in interesting ways. On the one hand, we present the institution of the monarchy, but with severe, severe qualifications on what the king is, and how the king is supposed to think, and what the king is supposed to do, and how he's supposed to conceive of his own task. The Nevi'im, in Sefer Shmuel, and later on throughout the Nevi'im, the constant dialectic between the king and the Navi, and the constant critique of the king and what he does and how he acts, is precisely part of this idea that the power, when it's centralized, leads to greater corruption and greater harm, and not just to greater good. Chazal, the institution of the kingship, is represented and described as a machloket. On the one hand, Rabbi Yehuda embraces the notion and sees the centralization of power as an ideal, while Rabbi Nehorai sees it as entirely not ideal, as a mere concession, and Rabbi Eliezer offers us a kind of middle position in which it depends upon the motivation, depends upon whether you see the king as a source of justice and good, or whether you see the king as a source of something grandiose, some way of being just like the other nations, and not a way of pursuing those Jewish goals. This sort of way of addressing a question which is a deep question is very common. That Chazal represents deep questions not as discussions in terms of we represent the sides, but each side is represented as an opinion amongst the rabbis, and that way we can sort of see the complexity of the situation and address it ourselves and try to resolve it for ourselves in our own particular political environment. Shabbat Shalom.